Good evening, Professor, distinguished guests. We do apologise for the delay. We've had torrential rains a few minutes ago, and I don't know what's happened to our communication. I first went to China in 1966. It was quite difficult for a foreigner to go there at that time, and I eventually got a visa in Hong Kong. Our country didn't have diplomatic contact with China, and I crossed the border and I then travelled. I was in Beijing in June 1966, and when I woke up on the first morning, there was a great commotion. At about sunrise, truck after truck went through the city streets, the truck loaded with people standing up. And at breakfast, I asked my interpreter, what's happening? The interpreter said, they're on their way to the city hall to protest about the behavior of the mayor of Beijing. Now, the dismissal of the mayor of Beijing was the starting point of the Cultural Revolution in June 1966. I must say it was quite bewildering to be in Beijing there. No foreigners were to be seen. I went to the Great Hall and there were no tourists there. I had a good look at the economy, and I thought in some ways China at that time was the economic dunce of the world. You'd go to a farmyard and there would be 100 people with flails standing in a row and beating the stalks of grain so that the grain could be released from the stalks. You'd see two women busy looking after livestock. One might be looking after one cow all day. Another woman might be looking after two geese. Early in the morning, I went out in the streets for a walk, and all kinds of strange sights were seen. Here in the capital city were camels pulling wagons loaded with produce. Men heavily loaded were walking past. No sign at that stage of any truck. I went to the food market, and admittedly I didn't reach it until 8 a.m. in the morning, and the food market was almost empty of food. Here was a country really struggling in its economic life under Chairman Mao and his communist dictatorship. I could not conceive that China in my lifetime would become one of the success stories of the world, but here it is. China, after a period of mishaps and disasters, is in many ways the great success story of modern times. Since 1980, it has won a victory against poverty on a large scale simply by transferring
Rowan, probably we can move to you if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I don't know what happened, so I'm sorry about that. Do you want me?
Sorry,
do you want me to?
sorry, I have it up. Do you mind starting yourself so we can?
No, that's fine. If you just, are you going to introduce me, or I just start speaking? You say when.
But I don't know if I have to introduce you because you have many hats.
No.
You are a great, a very well-known author and columnist, and well, I was very proud because I was really understanding your accent very well, and that's because
Good.
you're English. You're not
Yeah.
Australian. So I found out that
Okay.
I didn't have that problem. He's the Exeter University. He has a lot of articles, and everybody that is here listening to you knows your well and interesting trajectory. So thanks, Rowan, for taking the floor now.
Okay.
Oi,
Thank you, Professor. Okay. Hola, ni hao. Good evening and good morning to everyone. It's delightful to be invited to talk with friends from Chile. Of course, one of my favorite countries, which I had the pleasure to visit a few years ago in order to research and write about trade and other issues. And it's a special honor now to be asked to talk alongside two especially respected Australian thinkers, Geoff and Greg. How the rest of the world responds to what is happening in the People's Republic of China is, in my view, the critical question of our time. How we do so will determine the future of liberal democracy, of independent legal systems, of free-thinking writers and free-spirited artists, of religious institutions. We must ask, what does China want and what will it do? Its longtime foreign minister, Chen Chi-chen, said that diplomacy is the extension of domestic policy. In order to learn why China is behaving as it is internationally, it is essential to understand what drives the Communist Party that has ruled it for 72 years, which is today effectively the sole institution in China. No organization exists, from a football team to a church to a university to a private business, that is not guided by a party representative or branch within it. The party's General Secretary, Xi Jinping, famously says, East, West, North, South, and the center, the party leads all. It is crucial to understand something about Xi himself. He's also, in his second most important role, the chairman of the Central Military Commission, and in his least important role, the president of the Chinese state. Xi is today the most powerful person in the world, age 67, now constitutionally able to govern for life without a single constraint, except the underlying requirement to maintain the confidence of influential members of the party. He has, through the continuing anti-corruption purge that elevated him to the top job, replaced the key officials in both party and government, and also in the People's Liberation Army, that is the party's own army, not the state's. China's elite decision-making through a melange of leading small groups, 7 of them chaired by Xi Jinping, and the Politburo Standing Committee of 7 men, no woman ever chosen in 100 years, has become under Xi especially a black box, but its core thinking is clear to all who take an interest. Xi is a risk taker, a dice roller. He keeps pressing on because, of course, he believes in historical determinism, in communism's ultimate victory, and also because of his personal experience of political success, although this naturally involves struggle. In a recent speech, Xi used the word for struggle, Dojang, 60 times in his 3-hour address to the 19th National Party Congress, for which I was in the Great Hall of the People, my binoculars fixed on him. Xi said, this great struggle, this project, great cause and great dream are closely connected, flow seamlessly into each other, and are mutually reinforcing. Among them, the great new project of party building plays the decisive role. Our mission, he stressed, is a call to action. Let us engage in a tenacious struggle. One of the earliest and most important instructions issued by the party under Xi's leadership, document number 9, requires party members and all officials to guard against and vigorously oppose 7 threats: universal values, press freedom, civil society, citizens' rights, reviewing the party's version of history, and endorsing either the capitalist class or the independence of the judiciary. Xi bears little resemblance to other political leaders anywhere. He's neither a pragmatic factional player nor a cynical tyrant like the sidekick he's called my best, most intimate friend, Vladimir Putin. He is a true believer, an evangelist, and his party that he leads for life contains all truth and is his religion. 2 Australian parliamentarians were instructed by the Chinese embassy to truly repent if they were to be granted visas to visit China. The party is no more questionable than God's existence in a theocracy. It contains all truth. The 20th century German philosopher Carl Schmitt, a considerable influence on Nazi governance and a foremost critic of parliamentary democracy and cosmopolitan liberalism, who titled his major work Political Theology, Creating Statism as a Form of Religion, has become in recent years one of the most widely studied and admired philosophers at Chinese universities and party schools. For Xi, China is the greatest, most ancient of civilizations. The party has wrapped itself around everything to do with China that it views positively, and the party itself is encapsulated by the figure it has made, however reluctantly and accidentally, its leader for life, himself. His thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era is now enshrined in both party and state constitutions. Both the party and Xi are today pervasive. They are able to observe every online message or phone call sent or received by every Chinese person, and to watch through grid management system every step people take in the real world too. Xi has centralized, restructured, and personalized governance through a form of counter-reformation, refocusing on ideology and on the party's control over China's understanding of history. Accountability in this structure always operates upwards, not downwards. The party takes the view that the masses are unable to think coherently, only to feel. Hence, Chinese people cannot be trusted to vote, but one can very readily hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. As the Deputy Ambassador to Canberra, Wang Xining, said recently that Australia had done. There's no successor to Xi in sight. At some stage, of course, that will create grief for Xi and for the party. He is surrounded by loyalists. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, a Chinese speaker, said last week, most of Xi's senior officials are terrified of him. They are highly unlikely, therefore, to be providing frank and fearless advice. His narrative carries conviction, nevertheless, because he is so sincere about it. While the Soviet Party thought 30 years ago that its problems lay in ideology and party orthodoxy, the Chinese Communist Party came to the opposite conclusion, which she underlined in asking, why did the Communist Party of the Soviet Union fall to pieces? Because in the ideological domain, competition is fierce. To completely repudiate the history of the party, to repudiate Lenin and Stalin, was to wreak chaos, she said in the speech. Xi's top priority has been to purify the party, which he saw lapsing into slackness and corruption, insisting on personal loyalty and on the party's absolute centrality. Networks used to comprise the greatest asset for those within the Chinese hierarchy, as well as for foreigners dealing with the People's Republic, opening space for much to be negotiated. Now there are rules which spring from the grand narrative of party ideological primacy. To rise in Xi's China, one must demonstrate how well one knows and walks this righteous path. The Shuixi Qiangguo app, Study to Make China Powerful, provides a questionnaire that takes about an hour to complete about Xi's speeches, philosophy, and life story. All 91 million party members must complete it daily, as must all managers in state institutions, such as universities, and many in private firms too. Bonuses, promotions, or the reverse, hinge off these app scores, which are published. It is now no longer enough to be expert. One must be convincingly read as well. She has faced three especially big challenges over the past year: how to resolve the persisting protests in Hong Kong, how to survive the initial gross mishandling of the COVID pandemic, and less troubling, how to cope with a weird American president who's better known and understood, and a problem that has now gone away, of course, although he may find the new president who's better known and understood in Beijing over time becoming more difficult to deal with than Trump. For Hong Kong, he applied tactics he'd already used to subjugate China's vast Western hinterland: wear down critics, isolate them, punish them, and install devout personal loyalists to key supervisory roles. After Party Secretary Chen Chuangguo did such a good job of Sinicizing Buddhist Tibet, she sent him to Xinjiang to do the same to the Muslim Uyghurs. By Sinicizing, she means preferencing the dominant so-called Han culture, including its language Mandarin, over China's many other diverse cultures and languages. Beijing started off claiming it was preventing terrorism by targeting Uyghurs it branded splitists, but it became a program of preventing Uyghurs from being Muslim and, to a certain extent, from being Uyghur. In Beijing's eyes, job done. Then, after COVID had closed Hong Kong down, she imposed on the city the national security law, so troublemakers there could be tried and jailed in the mainland. Beijing recently also changed the governance structure so that all leading officials, judges, and those allowed to stand for the legislature must demonstrate their Chinese patriotism and respect for the Communist Party to a new vetting panel. The arrangement of one country, two systems, agreed for Hong Kong between Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher, never appealed to Xi and has been abandoned. Xi's new era governance insists on one country, one system. After an initial period of almost panic, when many in China turned critical over the party's attempts to silence whistleblower doctors over the emergence of COVID, Xi regained his firm footing through a classic propaganda coup, being newly dubbed the People's Leader, winning the People's War against COVID, while the capitalist nations, particularly in North America and Europe, wilted. Having faced such challenges over the last year, Xi looks to be on much surer ground in this new year of the ox, an auspicious year for folk who, like Xi, keep on keeping on with a premium for strength. Taiwan, a lively and prosperous democracy with a population greater than Chile, and now also the world's exemplar in combating COVID, is Xi's next and most important target, his final big borderland challenge. Invading and holding down Taiwan is the most assured route into the Communist Hall of Fame for Xi, who next July 23rd presides over the party's centenary. Such great anniversaries are often marked in China by grand military parades, but the party's anxiety about its own hold over the Chinese people its own legitimacy, is such that these events are never permitted to be viewed by any member of the public. The streets are closed off, and police instruct even those with apartments facing them that if they venture onto their balconies to watch, they may be shot by army snipers. In broad terms, the goals of Xi comprise, in this order: keep the party in power at all costs, maintain national territorial integrity, grow the national economy fast enough to break out of the middle income trap, to grow rich before growing old, gain sufficient military might to deter the US and its allies from intervention over Taiwan, the South China Sea, or the East China Sea, become the world's top tech power and thus leading economy, undermine US credibility sufficiently to attract its partners into Chinese association instead, deepen the relationship with Russia to guard against Western pressure, diminish the US dollar's status as the global reserve currency, consolidate the Belt and Road Initiative into a dependable geopolitical bloc, construct a new international order that reflects PRC thinking. Weaponizing its economy, the PRC's most important strategy of recent years, requires people at home and abroad to stay convinced it will thrive and drive world growth. But what if China's economy loses its edge, its vitality, its mojo? This has seemed unthinkable, but China's role as the world's factory, which it has recently resumed thanks to COVID-era demand for tech gadgets and health gear, substantially funded by Western governments' stimulus spending, faces challenges as supply chains diversify out of China. Beijing's politics is getting in the way of good economic policy. That includes Xi's distaste for entrepreneurs, such as the famous Alibaba founder, Jack Ma, as well as its use of trade coercion, including against Australian imports. Canada has abandoned free trade talks with China as not worth pursuing. China's three drivers of growth, credit, internal migration, and exports, are becoming over time increasingly constrained, while in the longer term, its demographics, with the former one-child policy causing it to age very rapidly, will also create big headaches. Xi's response is to champion a new economic template called dual circulation to take center stage in the new 14th five-year plan, with domestic demand taking over from exports and investments as the key economic driver. Its protectionist elements appeal to Xi, but to succeed will require the state to concede a greater role to private firms in the market, something he cannot easily stomach politically. New guidelines on strengthening united front work of the private economy in the new era say that the party aims, quotes, to build a backbone team of private business people that is dependable and usable by the party. Business people must maintain high consistency with the party, the guidelines say. The upshot is that Xi may be feeling right now that he should push on the accelerator towards global leadership, the party's important new source of domestic legitimacy, while he still possesses sufficient exportable capital to fuel economic weaponization. 40 years ago, leading economist Chen Yun stressed that while China should reintroduce markets, they needed to be contained like songbirds within a cage that comprised economic planning. Today, the party comprises that cage, and everything, every institution, thought, culture, ethnicity, the rule of law, religion, even and especially the Chinese state itself, may be free to flutter around, but only insofar as the party permits. Xi says, power must be kept caged by the system. Xi's narrative also underlines that the party's way is best for the rest of our region and for the wider world. His Belt and Road Initiative, to which Chile signed on 2 and a bit years ago, comprises a highway down which all roads and tech platforms lead to Beijing, as they once did to Rome, fueled and powered by the weaponization of China's economic heft. The Belt and Road Initiative updates the old tribute state structure through which Chinese emperors received from regional rulers formal acknowledgement of their dominance and were in return accorded trading rights and a degree of strategic shelter. Yang Jiechi, now China's top foreign affairs official, said in Hanoi a few years ago, China is a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact. Xi has, through seizing reefs and islands and building military bases on them, gained control of the South China Sea that is twice the size of the Mediterranean and is now a Chinese lake. Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar have become tribute states, ensuring that ASEAN, the association of 10 Southeast Asian nations that makes decisions by consensus, cannot counter China's interests, just as China's Security Council vote prevents any unwelcome UN action or words. China is no longer a status quo power. It has become a revisionist power, seeking to reshape the world. Myanmar is the most recent example of success in this goal, at least for now. Strategic pipelines carry oil and gas across Myanmar from the Bay of Bengal to China's Yunnan province, avoiding a long and risky sea voyage around Southeast Asia. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi flew to Myanmar for meetings with military chief Min Aung Hlaing 19 days before the coup there. Beijing has stressed that the coup is a domestic matter and has diluted criticism of it at the UN. Xinhua news agency described the coup as a major cabinet reshuffle, while Global Times said it comprised an adjustment to the country's dysfunctional power structure. Beijing only expressed real displeasure when 32 Chinese factories were burned by protesters angry at what they perceive as China's backing for the coup. China has shifted gears in its foreign diplomacy. It now requires its diplomats to adopt aggressive wolf warrior language and demeanor. It wishes not only to set the terms in which it engages the world, but even to control the way in which the world speaks of China. Yuan Peng, head of the State Security Ministry's top think tank, says, it is no longer important whether it is the truth or a lie. What matters is who holds the discourse power. The former head of Singapore's foreign ministry, Bilahari Kausikan, says, China doesn't just want you to comply with its wishes, it wants you to do what it wants without being told. The People's Republic has developed a strategy of embracing high-value elite partners who are persuaded that China's interests are also genuinely the best interests of their own country or organization. Such partners are cleverly introduced through their contacts with Chinese officials, academics, business people, and others to talking points that guide the manner in which they lead their organization's discourse on China. They typically include that all people of Chinese ethnicity owe loyalty to the People's Republic, that the People's Republican Party cannot and must not be separated from China and the Chinese people whom the party state rules, nor from the history and culture of the multifaceted Chinese civilization. That anyone who criticizes the PRC is doing so because they've fallen under the thrall of Washington, and that democracy or federalism will both be disastrous for China. Australia-China expert John Garneau says that the party is intent on making the world safe for itself. One of Xi's favorite films is The Godfather, who famously made offers people couldn't refuse. In 2021, he will make offers or threats disguised as offers, such as commercial deals, or perhaps China-made COVID vaccines in return for UN votes for friendly rhetoric and for refusing to contain China. But Australia and other partners can and will refuse such offers. Our economic opportunities are diversifying, and some in the Communist Party's own middle ranks are starting to murmur that their godfathers done okay for them. But instead of endless struggle, it's now time to consolidate, to chill, to let them enjoy at last the fruit of their hard-won prosperity. But Xi is determined. He has suffered no serious setback, or at home or abroad. He will press on, and we have to take notice. Thank you very much for listening to me.
It's David Hawker here. Thank you, Rowan. That was fantastic. As we're having these technical difficulties, we're hoping we might be able to get a copy of that presentation, because it really was superb. And I think rather sobering, could I use that word? Now, if everyone's happy, Professor Blainey could continue where he stopped before we lost contact. I apologise for the quality, because this is only on my telephone, but I think you can all hear. Is that right?
Yes, we can hear you. Perfect.
Okay. Can I put Professor Blainey back on, and he'll just take up where he got to?
So sorry, David, for this
Yep.
interruption, but Professor Sheridan, I think he has a problem to get into the conference. We are trying to help him. We call him, but I don't know if the person who's helping you probably can call him and also
We
help
haven't.
him.
We've got
No.
technical problems here, so hopefully
Okay.
he'll find a way in. But in the meantime,
Okay, our team is helping him, so don't worry. We will try
right,
to make it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you. Right, Geoffrey, there you go. No, I just put you.
Hello. Hello, this is Geoffrey Blainey again. I was fascinated by Rowan Callick's address. It really is a sobering analysis. One of the curious things about China is that the belief is widespread that it is overpopulated and must have new territory. This view is sometimes cultivated by China and is widely held even in many universities in the Western world. No, China is not overpopulated. Bangladesh is 8 times as overpopulated as China. South Korea, in density of population, is 3 times as crowded as China. India, with 1.4 billion people, will overtake China very soon in population, but India is much less crowded. Even India is much less is crowded than China. Go to Europe and you soon discover nations which are really overcrowded compared to China. Even Britain and Germany are overcrowded compared to China. Many of you have probably been to Italy, and it is definitely more crowded than China. Incidentally, Rowan Callick spoke about Taiwan. Even Taiwan is 4 times as densely settled as China. Of course, South America and Central America are not crowded compared to China. And yet the theory that China is overpopulated is extremely influential. China takes in as few migrants as possible. It takes in very few refugees, unless they are Chinese, and yet Southeast Asia is a region teeming with refugees. People automatically forgive China, saying that there's no room for more people. But in fact, China could take in large numbers of refugees if it wished. The People's Republic of China is entitled to make this choice of excluding foreigners, but the choice should be seen with some realism. Will China take in the refugees who look like pouring across the American border? And not on your life. Will China take in refugees from Africa? God forbid. China and its sense of grievance. China has a strong sense of grievance. They have the widespread grievance that in the last 2 centuries, they have been constantly harmed and humiliated by the great powers of the Western world. In my view, this grievance is heavily exaggerated. But the grievance itself is a factor, an influential factor in shaping President Xi's view of the outside world. He says he does not wish China ever to be humiliated again. It's true that China has been hurt and even crippled by outside nations in the last 150 years. Japan fought China in a short war in the mid-1890s, and in the next Formosa, now known as Taiwan. Britain snatched Hong Kong and the new territories in the 19th century when China was weak. It's also true that the Germans seized the great harbour of Qingdao in the northeast of China when China was weak. The foreigners, too, created further havoc. In the early 1930s, the Japanese invaded China, committed many atrocities, and were still in occupation of a huge area of Chinese soil at the end of the Second World War in 1945. So China has legitimate grievances, and they seem to have an iron grip on the mind of the present leader. On the other hand, so many of China's wounds have been self-inflicted. China has shown almost a unique capacity for long civil wars. Even in the 19th century, China fought a long civil war, the Taiping Rebellion. That rebellion commenced in 1850, lasted for 14 years, and took away as many lives as did the First World War amongst all the nations that fought in it. Another long civil war between the Chinese communists and the nationalists was waged on and off for about 20 years, finally ending in 1949 when the communists were successful. And then came the disastrous Cultural Revolution, extending from about 1966 to 1977. It was really a bitter civil war within the Communist Party. The deaths were numbered only in the tens of thousands, but the lives ruined, the Chinese lives ruined, numbered tens of millions. If I might reminisce slightly, in 1979, the Australian government appointed me chairman of the Australia-China Council. Its aim was to improve relations between Australia and China and to help China, if possible. I had the chance to meet many Chinese leaders, and it was astonishing to hear the humiliation that they themselves received, having been deposed in the Cultural Revolution. I had a lot of time with Wong Bing Man. He was one of the most influential figures in China in the 1950s. He was the ambassador to Warsaw, and there, unknown to the world, year after year, he met an American ambassador, and they carried on relationships between China and the United States. Wong Bing Man returned to China, was seen as too influential and to influence by foreigners, and during the Cultural Revolution was imprisoned for several years in an abandoned hotel. One day, the remains of his wife were brought in from him to see. They said she'd committed suicide. He could see from the wounds that she had not committed suicide. He had a terrible time, and eventually he returned to favor. So many of the leaders were humiliated. The leader of China in the 1980s, Zhao Ziyang, was a prisoner in the Cultural Revolution. He worked on a farm extremely hard, year after year, not knowing whether he would ever see his wife. He was even treated dismally. At lunchtime, the other laborers had a siesta. He was refused the right to have a siesta. One could go on and on. The present President Xi, his parents, influential, were victims of the Cultural Revolution, and he, for a short time, had to work as a laborer. Eventually, he gained a degree in chemical engineering and rose to power. But he's one of the people strongly affected by this astonishing period in the history of China, where its own leaders were deposed and humiliated. The Cultural Revolution was an era of self-inflicted humiliation. The Cultural Revolution was an era of self-inflicted humiliation. And then has come this almost miraculous awakening of China, a great economy. It was once a dunce amongst the great powers, and now it's one of the mighty. That really is a miracle. And it has a leader who's probably even more powerful than Chairman Mao in his heyday.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Blainey, for that wonderful historical perspective. I think it really does explain a lot of the situation in China today. Unfortunately, we know that Greg Sheridan is here in Melbourne, but it seems the internet's causing problems right across Melbourne at the moment. I apologise for that, but these matters are beyond our control. I know Greg Sheridan would be very keen to talk, and I just hold up for you all, if you can see it. There's a newspaper here, which it just says, China arms for war as Quad fights back. Now, this was in the Weekend Australian 10 days ago, and it talks about the situation that I think Rowan has sort of already discovered.
Can I read 4 lines?
Yeah, and Professor Blainey will actually read 4 lines because the Quad powers are Japan, Australia, United States, and India. But Professor Blainey will just read you the lines he thinks the most pertinent.
This is the article by Greg Sheridan, written last Saturday. I'll just read you the beginning in his absence. Military conflict in the Pacific, which would certainly involve Australia, is becoming more likely. These are not hysterical words. They are the implicit message, in the words of Chinese President Xi Jinping, at the National People's Congress in Beijing this week. They are the explicit message of the US Indo-Pacific commander, the man who would have to fight such a conflict, Admiral Philip Davidson. And they are the reality behind the remarkable convening of the first ever summit involving Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, Joe Biden, the Japanese Prime Minister, and India's leader. He goes on to say, make no mistake, countering China and avoiding war is the purpose of the meeting of those 4 leaders. And then he goes on to conclude his article. Well, the article goes on to the next page, and it will take me too long to find it. But he says, China is really an incredible, powerful nation, and it threatens the peace of a large part of the world. I don't do justice to him, but that's his point of view.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Professor Blainey for giving that quick summary of what Greg no doubt would have been able to deliver in at more length, but as I say, unfortunately, Melbourne seems to be having problems with the internet at the moment. So could I suggest we go straight to questions, unless you would like to say something, Professor Lopez Corral? You happy to go with questions? Did you want to say?
Yes, we have many questions. Rose is here.
Yes, I was going to suggest,
And
Mr. Hawker, I believe you have some questions that I've sent you, and perhaps you would like to start asking some of them. Some of them are addressed to a specific speaker. Some are in general. So if you would kindly decide how to go on with the questions.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll start with one from Jochen Firmendoa. He talks about something specific to Chile. Initially, Chile promoted TPP 11, that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership 11, a free trade agreement. However, political developments over the last 2 years have led some of those promoters, as well as increasing sensibilities inside Chilean politics and culture, to identify the treaty as neoliberal, a demonized concept in Latin America, and according to many, including himself, that it's a potentially a fatal mistake and the chances of approval are dim. So the question, what historical, economic and strategic argument could you offer to persuade both the Chilean public and Congress that there is a need for the treaty? Maybe Rowan, would you like to take that question?
Rowan, you have to turn on your micro, please.
So this
Rowan,
treaty has actually gone into effect in, I think, 12 countries. So it's being used by business people already to move goods and services in the Pacific region. One can I'm not in a position to do this, but whatever company you may be interested in, or whatever good or service, you can check to see how useful those people are finding this. It's a more rigorous form of agreement than we have through the lowest common denominator World Trade Organization arrangements, and through quite a lot of other free trade deals, including some of those that we in Australia have bilaterally. So it's being used on the top of those. The United States famously declined to join it, and that appeared to be a bipartisan position. We have not really much of an idea whether Joe Biden may revisit that, but it's gone ahead mainly with Japanese leadership. And now there's some discussion about China entering the arrangement, but it would have to open itself to perhaps more rigorous questioning and testing in areas related to labor arrangements than it has done before. It might not be willing to do that, but we'll see. We also have this big regional comprehensive economic partnership, RCEP, which has spun out of ASEAN, really. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, remains the hub for most organizational institutions in the whole of East Asia and the Pacific, really, our part of the world. And so RCEP is now in place, but it's not, it is fairly loose, whereas the questioner asked, TPP is more demanding. I really can't say much more on that. We in Australia tend to support greater freedoms for trade, because I guess we're fairly accustomed to looking at comparative advantage and being reasonably flexible in terms of shifting our focus into those areas. So that's all I can say about TPP at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Rowan. I'll ask the next question to Professor Blainey, and it came from Michael Loriski. He said, we are conditioned into thinking of China as a monolith, as was the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire that it replaced. But history has shown that such entities are more than capable of collapse in a crisis, whether through war or economic malaise. A language map of China, which I have here, but it's hard to see, shows a patchwork quilt that is surely also vulnerable in extreme circumstances. That's all the different languages across China. What, in your opinion, is the likelihood of a Chinese implosion in the event at some point there is a very low or negative economic growth in China, or that China becomes embroiled in a crisis of military adventurism? And I'll give that one to Professor Blainey.
That's a difficult question to ask and to answer, but it has to be asked. My first thoughts is that China has had a very long history of civil conflict. I mentioned a few minutes ago the Great Rebellion in the middle of the 19th century, in which 20 million lives were lost in the Chinese Civil War. I mentioned, of course, the long and well-known war between the communists and the nationalists in China. And there's a sense in which the Cultural Revolution was a kind of civil war, so that here is a country which at the moment seems impregnable. You could not conceive of it breaking down or dividing in any way, and yet the history shows that even a country like China is vulnerable, and in some way or other, it could suddenly show symptoms of division and begin to break up. Of course, if it conducted a short war against Taiwan and the war was not successful, well, that would be a terrible blow to the prestige of the president in China. If there was a famine in China, and China having alienated so many of its trading partners, could not feed its own people, well, of course, that could very well lead to civil conflict. So I don't see the continuation of the present regime in China, as strong as it is, as inevitable. But you do have to keep in mind that powerful countries break up. Who would have predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse? Who would have predicted that in 1980, and yet in 1990 the collapse was all before us?
If I could just add, David, that yes, as Jeff said, this is the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, concentrated minds wonderfully in Beijing, and huge attention has been devoted by the party to looking at what happened. I made a few comments about this, about what happened, what went wrong, and so on. So they feel that rather than moving towards glasnost or perestroika, their answer is to move in a rather different direction. And so China has become more centralized, not less. That creates dangers of its own in a country as large as China. To talk about federalism is almost as dangerous as to talk about democracy in China. And there's no, as I said in my remarks, no alternative organizations. So this creates some peril if the party should slip up. And I think Geoffrey quite rightly said that a misadventure in Taiwan is a classic potential trigger for that.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll go into another one from Jochen Vermandois. He talks about the rise of China with all its implications, which I think we've covered very well. The question really is, whether the new power upsetting the old international order, is it a case of the Russian situation, which happened when, as we mentioned, with the perestroika that's happened, as Professor Blainey, or are we looking at something more like the unified industrial and cultural state of Germany, which became subject to victimization as other powers did not accept it, that it had a right to exist? So the question is a denouement of that of 1914, or a development such as a German nationalism and victimization inevitable in present China? And could it be that a domestic evolution will lead to interpreting Chinese interests in the inevitable, in the long run, as convergent with the developed democracies in Asia and the West? Rowan, do you want to try that?
Geoffrey, I think, knows a lot more about the German situation, and I think he's better placed to talk about that.
Well, that too is a tantalizing question. In 1914, a great war had been expected for some time. Not everybody in Europe expected it, but so many of the political and military leaders thought it was likely. But the curious thing about 1914 is that the two alliances, Britain, France and Russia on the one side, and Germany and Austria on the other side, both went to war in the belief that they would win. They went to war also in the belief that they would win quickly. Their faith was strong in the British alliance that the war might be over before Christmas, with Britain and France the winner. On the other hand, and it's well documented, the belief in Berlin amongst the German commanders was that they would have a 6 weeks military campaign against their enemy, France, would knock France out of the war, and then move most of their huge army east to fight the Russians, and they would more slowly defeat the Russians. But in that war, both sides believed that they would win, and would win decisively. I think the present situation in the world between the great powers is very different. Nuclear weapons has changed the world. How much it's changed it permanently, we still don't know. But both China and the United States know that if they should go to war next year, and if by chance both should be using or close to using nuclear weapons, there would be the chance that both would in effect be the losers. So this situation, I think, is very different to any situation before 1945. I could be wrong, but the existence of nuclear powers has changed the world. China's been a nuclear power, I think, since 1964, Rowan, when it acquired the atomic bomb, and China knows that it could inflict enormous damage on its enemies with nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, will it dare use nuclear weapons? Would the United States dare nuclear weapons? So that there is a crucial factor new to this world. Curiously, when I was born in 1930, and my belief and the belief of most of the fellow students when I first went to university in the late 1940s was that there would be a world war in the next 20 years and that nuclear weapons would be used. That was a widespread belief, and yet the remarkable thing is this has been an astonishing long period of peace, partly because nuclear weapons have been a restraint on the big powers. Now, the situation is still to unfold, and we don't know what it will be, but I think the German analogy, which it's right to bring up, it's very important that we discuss it, is now outdated.
If I can add just a postscript, in most Chinese minds, the pivotal war was, of course, the war against Japan, fought for 8 years from 1937, and that remains the reference point for wars and the engagement.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for that. I would make the point that according to my screen, the one we can't use at the moment, we've had nearly 90 participants in this webinar or Zoom meeting, which is very encouraging. I have one here from Miguel Schweitzer. As a Chilean interested in foreign relations, I would like to know your point of view related to the near future of both Hong Kong and Taiwan. I know we've covered it in your presentation already, Rowan, but this is probably a little bit more specific. So do you relate the near future of both Hong Kong and Taiwan and the possibility of maintaining the policy two systems in one country, which I think you said was almost gone on the one hand, and do you think that we as Chileans will be able to continue in our economic and political neutrality with the statements of Foreign Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, saying that the United States-China relations will be competitive when they should be, of collaboration when possible, and confrontational when needed?
Yes, well, I think, well, in Hong Kong and Taiwan case, Hong Kong has been subsumed into the Chinese mainland amazingly rapidly. I lived and worked in Hong Kong for 4 years, straddling the time of the handover from Britain to China, and I have been astounded by the speed and success of Beijing's effective countering massive resistance amongst young Hong Kongers, the removal of leaders, the jailing of many, and so on. This has been a quite brilliantly conceived exercise and has succeeded in bringing Hong Kong into the mainland. Of course, the price is huge for many people in Hong Kong and for those in the world who, in fact, great connections with it. But as far as Xi Jinping is concerned, a big success. And in Taiwan's case, no success, really. Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, very capable woman, re-elected 13 months ago with an even bigger majority, a Democratic Progressive Party leader. And Taiwan has become really, in many ways, a sort of poster child of liberal democracy in all of Asia these days, in terms of its liberal social measures and free and open media, rule of law, and so on. And the people of Taiwan really, in my experience, and I go to Taiwan quite often, have expressed a diminishing interest in People's Republic. So for young people, if you ask them, what are you? They will say, I'm Taiwanese. And China is a foreign country. It's over the other side of the strait, 161 kilometers away. We are concerned about its continuing threats, physical threats, but it's somewhere else, and now a very different culture and so on. So of course, Taiwan only ruled by Beijing for 4 years in the last 125. So increasingly feels remote. But for people on the other side, because I talked about the importance of the control of the narrative of history by the party, Taiwan, even though the Communist Party itself at one stage said Taiwan should be allowed to become independent, the narrative in post People's Republic years has been strongly affirmed that Taiwan is, always has been, and will be in the future a part of China. And so, so we have two very different views. One country, two systems is now no longer discussed really in Taiwan. It's not something that even the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, which of course is the big sister party of the communists originally in the 1920s. The Kuomintang even don't support one country, two systems anymore in Taiwan, and in Hong Kong the idea is pretty well faded away, except among a little bit of the rhetoric of the officials who are in power there, but not really important. So as to Chile's case, can Chile just stay clear of all this? You know, let's be friends to everyone and everyone will love us. Sadly, that's not a realistic position in today's, in the situation today. People are looking for support, and we will find that while in Australia we do maintain a very strong economic relationship with China, very important. It's our #1 trading partner right now, and we have many marvelous people-to-people connections. The institutional connections, government to government, are to very low ebb, and I think that is kind of a pattern we're seeing around the world at the moment. As I speak, European Union and China are having a great spat of mutual sanctions, banning of individuals traveling and so on, over what the EU has said about Xinjiang and so on. This is going to happen, and Chile cannot stay apart from it, and we'll have to decide on each issue. It's an independent country where Chile wants to stand according to its values, and increasingly values are becoming as important as interests in determining foreign policy. I think this is a broad scale change that's happening in our world, and that's going to require thinking about values as well as interests.
May I add a thought about Hong Kong? In some ways, the sad situation in Hong Kong is an effect of the political decline of Europe. That couldn't have happened if Europe had remained, and Britain too, important political players in the world. The agreement between Britain and China was consummated in 1997, was that there would be a treaty that both would obey, but Britain had no power to enforce the treaty. Britain had ceased to be a great world power. If Britain had remained a great world power, then China would not have dared to carry on in Hong Kong as it has in the last 2 years.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much. I have a question that's come in from Michael Kroger. Could you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
We have a question.
David,
Yeah.
we also have a question from Leonidas Montes in the chat.
Okay, well, this is the first one I've got. Michael Kroger asks, how do you view China's vast investments in countries like Barbados, Zimbabwe, and dozens of other countries? Rowan, do you want that? Who's going to take that?
Yes, I don't know much about Barbados or Zimbabwe. I'm afraid I have to plead some. I just know what anyone else would know about those places. But China has certainly sought to deploy its capital, and much of it is capital gained from becoming rather brilliantly, as Geoffrey has pointed out, the world's factory, and has redeployed that capital overseas. It will need to do so even more because of the rapid shrinking, rapid demographic challenges at home, seeking to make its capital used overseas. I suppose, as always, the answer implies, oh, it depends what kind of capital and who's deploying it. So there's private capital some of it is flight capital, that private companies in China are becoming increasingly anxious about their situation, their standing. We've seen in recent times what's happened to Alibaba's founder Jack Ma. Some people were concerned when he went silent for 2 weeks, and people wondered about his personal future. And it's not surprising then, if such an illustrious person, the most famous entrepreneur China has ever produced, that people in the private sector should want to shift capital overseas if they can. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's people will benefit from smart Chinese entrepreneurs moving to other places. We in Australia are benefiting greatly from having smart Chinese entrepreneurs working here. If on the other hand, it's money from, let's say, state banks or from Chinese state-owned enterprises, there tend to be strings attached, and one needs to look at the strings very carefully. I think that there's a risk for China that it's made too many promises in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, and that so many people in the COVID era, countries are becoming economically, hamstrung, and so they're looking for help, and they're going to China, and China's not able to help everyone. And in any case, the Belt and Road money is always loans, and loans have conditionality attached. Whether China's in a position or has a desire to roll over or the loans or reduce the interest rates, I don't know. That's still being tested place by place, according to strategic priorities in Beijing. And so I wouldn't say all Chinese capital is bad or Chinese capital is good. I think it depends. One has to look place by place. Now, was there another part of that question, David, from Michael Kroger?
Oh, no, I think you've covered it. Yep, that's it. I'll just, Professor Blainey wants a quick word.
Could I just add to Rowan Callick's comment? To my mind, there's a big difference between China now as a great world power and the United States when, in the 1940s, it took on the role as a great world power. The United States as a nation was much more self-sufficient in all kinds of raw materials and manufactures then than China is today. And one of China's problems is it depends on so many other lands for vital raw materials. I mean, China doesn't produce enough petroleum products. China's a big producer of iron ore, but the iron ore is not very good. So it comes to Australia. China is building up in many parts of the world good connections in the hope that some of these will prove loyal servants of China in the event of a crisis. That's just my speculation.
Thank you. Now, Professor Lopez-Giral, you had some questions.
Sorry
Yes.
for the people who is translating. You are translating both at the same time in Spanish, so it's very confusing for the people who's trying to listen to you.
I have, may I have
Please.
Pero los dos al mismo tiempo.
Dorotea? May
Coordinen cuál de los dos.
I?
Sorry.
No, I was going to suggest if we could add some local questions, or I mean, questions are asked locally. Would you mind, Mr. Hawker?
Please do.
Things. I have one question that I think would be addressed to Professor Blainey, and it says that according to information, there are over 200 billionaires in China. That's more than the rest of the world. Would you consider that there's a contradiction with the definition of Marxism? the fact that there are so many billionaires in China, would that contradict
Marxism.
the concept of Marxism?
To my mind, that is a big contradiction of Marxism, that there should be such a great flock of millionaires in China who at the same time often pay lip service to Karl Marx and to his theory. It is a great contradiction to have the great Marx worshipping society in the world at the same time kowtowing to capitalism in so many corners of national life. I do agree.
I think I agree as well, but Xi Jinping has a doctorate in Marxism, his thought, his classic thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, I think where he has modernized Marxism is to adapt the idea that the state has to control the means of production. He's now moved away from that thought to a thought that the party has to have ultimate control over all the institutions engaged in the economic process. And so the actual ownership is not as important as having, for example, in a big international company like Huawei, having a party branch there in which members of the party, many of them working in the company and one or two from outside, will review issues like the appointment of the top management staff, will review the appointment of members of the board, will review strategic direction of the company. That is seen as more important in our modern era than Marx's ideas of controlling the means of production in the mid-19th century.
May I ask Mr. Callick another question directly to you? It says that the concept of international cooperation is constantly being invoked in China's foreign policy. It is so in the United Nations, in coordinating groups, in global economic organizations, etc. It can be assumed, however, that there are limits to the use of the concept of international cooperation, especially among asymmetric partners. Could you indicate whether there are elements of cooperation policy to highlight in the Pacific Basin that sets a difference with other international relationships? With that, does it make any? Does it call your interest? And what are the features of our mutual cooperation dedicated for a balanced and non-aligned approach towards China?
Sorry, we didn't hear.
Tienes que hablar más cerca del micrófono porque no te escuchamos la segunda parte de la pregunta. No, pero más cerca del micrófono, es que estás hablando hacia el otro lado, al micrófono.
Close to the microphone. We can't hear. We are having trouble in hearing.
No, no te podemos oír. No. No.
Shall I just say a few words anyway about international cooperation? I think many of these phrases are quite intriguing. The Chinese leadership has become quite astute at using phrases that appear to be global in their understanding, but are used in a very particular way. So we had a speech by Xi Jinping at the start of the year to the World Economic Forum at Davos. And this speech was very ironic in terms of China being peace-loving, China being the center of international cooperation, phrases like this. And I think that those of us in Australia who've been on the, who've also heard a very different type of vocabulary from China and from its diplomats, have been puzzled by this. The answer really is that China uses different vocabulary at different times for different audiences for its effect. The party is not answerable to anyone in China. It's not really answerable to anyone in the world. And if it chooses the way that it expresses itself at home and internationally, and if we might in Australia say this is hypocritical, that doesn't really matter, because the words are being heard, China hopes, by the audiences in a way that the audience is intended to hear those messages.
No. I'm sorry, my microphone is not working well. I'm sorry.
We can hear you now. Go ahead.
No, it's not working well. I'm sorry. You can't listen.
Yes,
to
we
me?
can hear. We can hear you now.
Yeah. So.
But if not, Rose, we have a last question from Leonidas Montes. We have it in the chat. I'm sure Rowan can read it for the chat. So we don't have a micro problem.
Yeah.
I don't see it.
So yes, Professor Montes has asked about the economic hegemony of China. And of course, we've all played a part in supporting the economic hegemony of China. This has been a benefit of the world, to the world, I have to say, because China has, in the last 2 decades, deflated the international economy. It has made consumer goods much cheaper and brought them within the reach of many ordinary people around the world. And China has become the place of assembly, particularly of many chains by which parts are brought together and assembled. So we have, you know, very cheap washing machines, televisions, computers, and so on. And that's been very broadly beneficial. However, there's some change now coming in that area, partly because of the extent to which those sources of international intellectual property that have also helped to bring the world these marvelous goods, those components that have been assembled in China, they are starting to become anxious about losing that intellectual property to the Chinese and so on, and starting to some companies are starting to be encouraged to move back out of China into Japan, back into South Korea, to Taiwan. And so we're starting to see perhaps the unraveling of these chains. And this is one reason why, as I said in my remarks, China's new economic aims are to create its own IP so that it will make the breakthroughs and derive new technology without depending on outsiders. This is a difficult process for China, partly because the invention process requires academic freedoms of a kind that are no longer so easily obtained in Chinese universities, which are now very thoroughly under the control of the party. And also in a more practical sense, it takes a long time to build up that kind of skill. So for example, semiconductors. China spends more money importing semiconductors, those chips that are crucial for all these products, than it does on importing oil. So, and the biggest semiconductor in the world by a long way is Taiwan Semiconductors. And that has big assembly plants in China, but its IP it holds very close. It's now investing more back in Taiwan. It's investing in a big factory in the United States and so on. So we're entering into an area of greater contestation and fragmentation of what used to be a fairly smooth process leading to, Professor Montes talks about economic hegemony. I'd rather talk about it integration. And we might be seeing some signs of disintegration, and I'm not sure what will happen as a result. I mean, we in Australia are particularly dependent on China as a market, less so for investment. Countries like Japan, United States, and Britain are bigger investors here.
Okay, I have a quick question here from Neil Brown. There has been a lot of talk about freedom of navigation exercises, which are well and good, but something more positive and permanent is needed. Would international law allow a fleet like the United States 7th Fleet to anchor in the South China Sea on a permanent or semi-permanent basis? It would be a powerful symbol and send a powerful message. Who'd like to take that?
Well, Neil Brown has been a very prominent Australian politician, and he has probably got a pretty good idea of what international law says. Many people would say that it's extremely assertive of China to take over these islands that are in dispute, and other smaller countries lay claim to them, and for China to fortify them and to turn them in effect into Chinese territory. I would be surprised if international law would support what China has done so far, but I'm not an international lawyer.
Well, yes, you're right, Geoffrey. I mean, the Philippines took China to the International Court and received strong support. But China, as I was saying before, its rhetoric changes. So while it urges everyone to accept international law, in this particular case, for example, where it was inconvenient, it ignored the ruling of the court and in fact made fun of the verdict and just has ignored it. At first it didn't matter. The Philippines President Duterte was courted successfully personally by China, but he's changed his direction again, and the United States is back collaborating militarily and in other ways there. And but I think that so yes, South China Sea is very important. A lot of the world's shipping goes through there because East Asia is the world's economic powerhouse now. So it's very important not only for China but for Korea, Japan, and so on. The US 7th Fleet, I suspect, Neil, that that US Pacific Command in Hawaii may not want to anchor its fleet there. I think that might be a very vulnerable place for it to put all its eggs, frankly. And while it's got a capacity to sail through those waters, I think it might keep the fleet somewhere else, bearing in mind that Hawaii historically hasn't proven always the safest place to put those ships.
Thank you. Professor Lopez, Gerard, do you have some more questions? I'm not sure how we're going for time.
I think we should finish. We have some more questions. I think still Rose has many more, but I think it's a bit late. And
okay, well, can I say a very, very big thank you for everyone who's participated. As I say, we had nearly 90 people on the line, and my sincere apologies for the problems in Melbourne with the internet. I'm not sure why they chose this morning for something to go wrong, but it's rather frustrating. And I'm very sorry that Greg Sheridan was unable to make his presentation. He has some very well-informed and quite strong views about the problems that we might have with China. So maybe there'll be another opportunity, because it's certainly a very, very live topic. But so in conclusion, could I say a very big thank you to the International Institute at the University of Chile, to our guest speakers, Professor Blainey and Mr. Rowan Callick. And I think the choice of topic, everyone ought to be congratulated on that. Chinese power, the new international dynamic. It is certainly very much an issue that's alive and well now, and will continue to be one of discussion. And of course, a special thanks to Professor Claudio Velas as well for all his work behind the scenes. So thank you, and I hope this is the first of many.
thank you very much. And I'm sure this is one of many more that we will develop together. So we will have the opportunity to listen. Greg, Sheridan, thanks to Professor Blainey, thanks to Professor Callick. I think it was a great seminar. And David, I'm very happy that the Conversazioni and the Institute are working together. Good night and have a nice day today.
Thank you.
And the best regards to Professor Bellis, and thanks for organizing this and the next ones that are coming.